Thanks very much, Lascan Corla. I was really struck, Minister, by a reference made in the recent ESRI report when they said that essentially, and I'm borrowing a little heavily and interpreting to a degree what they had said, but essentially what they were saying was for a lot of people low and middle incomes in Ireland today, in 2022, it's starting to feel like 2008 again. And I think that is a remark and a reference that would resonate with a lot of people. But the difference between 2008 and 2022 is that we have the resources now, if properly targeted, to insulate those who are less well off and those who are struggling on middle incomes to make ends meet, to get by. And our calls, and we back the Sinn Féin motion, we enthusiastically support it, but our calls for an emergency budget too are genuine, they're sincere, and they're made in an effort to be constructive, as my colleague and Labour Party leader, Deputy Ivana Bacik, said to the Taoiseach on leaders' questions earlier on today. And our first call for a comprehensive set of budgetary measures, our first call for an action of this nature wasn't made today, wasn't made yesterday, wasn't made last week or even last month. As far back as January, in a detailed motion brought to the floor of the House here, we presented a comprehensive set of targeted and costed proposals to the House to better help people to make ends meet during this very, very challenging cost of living crisis. Now, that package was valued at €1.5 billion, and some of these proposals have, to be fair to the government, since been implemented, such as the cut to excise duty on fuel, and it would be churlish of me not to acknowledge that. Now, that package was proposed, of course, when Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine was, at that point, only the stuff of speculation and intelligence reports. And we all know that the world has changed incredibly since. Of course, everything comes a distant second place to the incredible suffering of the people of Ukraine and the millions who have been displaced internally and externally. But, Minister, more has to be done. More has to be done to better insulate the hundreds of thousands of Irish citizens who are at the very sharpest end of the cost of living crisis. This crisis, Minister, is real. It's real, it's here, it's now. It's been experienced and lived now. Not in October, but now. The end of June 2022. So without comprehensive action, we'll not only be facing into a winter of discontent, but it will be a cruel summer for those who are on fixed low and middle incomes as they digest the news as reported in the recent Kantar survey that got a lot of media attention over the last few days, that the basic shopping will cost an additional €450 or so this year. Now, to put that in context, Minister, that's more than the gross weekly salary of somebody who's in the national minimum wage and is working a full week. That puts it in context. That's the pain that people are going to have to endure this year. It'll be a cruel summer too for those who, with 7 or 8 weeks to go until kids go back to school, they mightn't qualify for the back to school clothing and footwear allowance, who won't get free school books and who just can't pull the money together for a short summer break after the very difficult 2.5 years that everybody has had. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. On the day that she was elected leader of the Labour Party, my colleague Deputy Ivana Bacik called for an emergency budget then. That was in April. So we've done so time and again in order to be constructive. And so severe, Minister, is the crisis that we would be prepared to cut short the Dáil recess, in other words, to sit as long as it takes, up until August, if the government were prepared to work with us to develop and to legislate for a comprehensive set of targeted measures to help those who need the help most to make ends meet. Now, you will recall, Minister, because you were a deputy at the time, 2 budgets in 1 year were sometimes required when Fianna Fáil were last in government. When the public finances collapsed and severe cuts to public spending were to be proposed, this House and the then government didn't stick to the 1 budget a year convention. So if there's a national fiscal catastrophe, we can have as many budgets as we like in a year, as many budgets as the government of the day will decide. But when it's a financial crisis for a working family, hundreds of thousands of working families as it happens across the country. Well, it's a case of business as usual, and you'll just have to wait until October to see what can be worked out. Now, that's a really tough message to have to sell to people who found themselves having to hand back shopping when they get to the top of the queue, when they get to the till, and they realise that they haven't enough money in the purse or in the wallet to pay for all of the shopping that they may have put into the basket or the trolley. Now, there's no dignity in that. There's no dignity in that for working people and people who are struggling. Now, we're not calling on the government to protect everyone from the impact of inflation. That's manifestly and objectively impossible. Nobody is asking government to do that. And there are inputs here that contribute to the rising cost of living that are way beyond the control of the state. But Minister, if you're to double down on requests in this House for an emergency budget, if you're to deny the public the opportunity to have those targeted measures in place before the summer recess, can I ask you then that you manage and control your colleagues' utterances in the long run-in to October's budget? Because this will now be the longest run-in to a budget in living memory. And I think the people of Ireland are finding it hard enough to manage without the prospect of having to endure over the summer pre-budget kite after pre-budget kite being floated by government backbenchers and indeed by ministers as well, as they all try to outbid one another in the pre-budget stakes during the silly season. Because every bit of speculation that the government engages in really is causing more harm and more anxiety for hard-pressed householders who are already at the end of their tether at this moment in time. And of course, the biggest offender in terms of public utterances and riffing away on what might or might not be in the budget is the Taoiseach, who started the silly season early with his annual call, this ritual call now from the Taoiseach for tax cuts. Now, tax cuts, as you know, Minister, they disproportionately benefit the highest of earners. And if you're serious about targeted measures to help people who need the help the most, then you have to take tax cuts off the table. And if you're serious about using the resources that we do have in a targeted way, then you should use the additional €500 million that you intend to use, at least €500 million, to, for example, make primary education genuinely free. With what's left over from that €500 million, you can then ensure that we could make GP care free for more children, in an effort to move inch by inch toward the ambition of sláinte care. Now, in the government's determination to drag this out to October, you're building up enormous expectations around what you will actually deliver with the big bang approach that you seem to be conditioning us to expect. The expectations, of course, are already being built up, and you're talking up the performance of the economy. Now, it's a source of great pride, I think, for all of us that the economy is objectively performing so well. And when you look at it in the round, it is doing very, very well. But you can't eat GDP figures. We were initially told, of course, to expect a deficit of over €1 billion this year, but as has been put on the record earlier on this evening, we're likely to run a surplus of around €1.6 billion. Now, that's an incredible turnaround, and those resources generated through VAT windfalls, perversely on the things that have become the most expensive these days, such as energy costs. We need actually to see those windfalls make their way back into the pockets of those who need them most. We could, for example, on an administrative basis, without even requiring an emergency budget, decide that we could use some of the money that's left over from the COVID contingency fund to channel that to core social welfare rate recipients with what might be known as a summer bonus. That would be a targeted way to make an intervention to put money into the pockets of some of those who need the most. And that call that we made a couple of months ago has essentially been backed up by the ESRI. And we asked last year as well in our alternative budget to ensure that we could help those who work hard, who are earning less than €50,000, with a carbon credit that might generate about €200 for them to help them make ends meet as well. So a range of different things that we could do, even without an emergency budget, if the political will was there on an administrative basis to help people between now and October. And we'll be watching very, very closely at the Low Pay Commission's report, which will be due by law by the end of the third week of July, to see what it is they're going to recommend in terms of an increase to the national minimum wage. If the government is to remain between the ditches and meet its target in terms of a living wage, not just a rebranding of the national minimum wage to a living wage, there will need to be at least a €1 an hour increase to the national minimum wage this year. And I say this year deliberately, because if there was a recommendation made to increase the minimum wage, it needs to be introduced immediately after the budget in the middle of October, and we cannot wait until the 1st of January, as is normally the case.